Lisa Commendatori. I'm the Director of Student Orientation, Parent and Family Programs, and it's our pleasure to host you on campus this weekend. More importantly, it's exciting for us to have you join us for our Meet the Author series. Today we have Steve Pemberton, who is the Chief Human Resources Officer at Globoforce, the leading social recognition provider for companies worldwide. Prior to that, he served as Chief Diversity Officer for Walgreens, becoming the first person to hold the position in the company's 114-year history. One of America's most inspiring executives, Steve brings a deep personal understanding of human differences and the human experience to his position. He was a ward of the state for much of his childhood, an experience he chronicled in the 2012 best-selling memoir, A Chance in the World, which has been translated into multiple languages and inspired readers around the world. Now a motion picture, A Chance in the World has brought Steve's extraordinary life journey to a national movie audience. The film is scheduled for release on December 1st in 60 different countries. Steve's tireless advocacy for his disenfranchised has earned him numerous accolades. His dedication to public service, personal, and professional achievement have also earned him honorary doctorates from Winston-Salem State University in 2014 and Boston College in 2015. In 2015, Steve was also awarded the prestigious Horizon Award by the United States Congress, presented to individuals from the private sector who have contributed to expanding opportunities for all Americans through their own personal contributions and who have set exceptional examples for young people through their successes in life. If you could please join me in giving a warm welcome to Steve Pemberton.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let me step out. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Did we grab some wood and two of every animal? I was very hopeful I was getting here. I live in Chicago these days, and so my flight took off, and the pilot, she comes on and she says, "I know that you hear these announcements all the time, but I really need you to pay attention to this one." So when you hear that, you go, okay, so you really paid attention. But I'm glad to be here on a number of levels. So I have some remarks and some things I just generally want to talk about because there's a lot to talk about, both here at Northeastern and then I think in the world. I actually went to another institution in the Boston area. I went to Boston College. Please don't hold that against me. But this Northeastern was actually, during my time here in the city, was like my next home. So I knew Northeastern just as well as I knew Boston College. This was the place where my fraternity was. This was also a place where my best friend went to school, who subsequently was my best man and godfather to my children. So there's a really deep connection. I see the traffic on Huntington Ave is just as bad as I ever remember it, not a lot better. And I actually proposed to my wife right down the street at the top of the Prudential building, and she wonderfully, magnificently said yes. It's been working out 21 years later, been working out ever since. Yeah, thank you. I'll tell you the story about how we met and what I said, some advice. And this is more for those of us who are a little bit younger. So you heard a bit about my bio. My day-to-day life actually is a bit like yours. I am, hyper-scheduled, over-scheduled, busy, just a lot of things always, going on. And I'm in the corporate world and have been for the last, 20-odd years. So I'm in a lot of long-winded meetings with PowerPoints and people repeating themselves over and over and over again. I have this theory, actually, that if you eliminated the words echo, reiterate, and piggyback, you could cut all meetings down to like 15 minutes. That's my theory. That's the one that I'm going to stick to. On the other hand, I feel that particularly because I have a senior in high school who's going to be headed off to college next year, that I'm actually the one who's going to be needing some advice from you, because I will confess that I'm not really ready, for that. Although I have to be ready because it is his time, and I had, our time with him. For the first 10 years of my career, I actually worked in higher education, so I was around students and families all the time, and not once did I ever really fully appreciate just how powerful, important, momentous that process is of watching your greatest gift and treasure head off to college. I mean, I would see it, but I didn't really experience it. And now that I am on the cusp of experiencing that, I'm trying to figure out the logic, like how am I going to deal with this? Because I'm going to miss him quite dearly. But it is his time, and that's how I think about it. And that, I think, is it's kind of like the deal that God makes with us as parents, right? I'm bringing you your greatest gift ever, and then you have this wonderful responsibility to nourish it and then let that gift go to the world. And that's the deal. And you take that deal every time, because we now know the wonderful impact that has on all of us. During my undergraduate days, the older members of my fraternity said that whenever you have something important to say in a short period of time to say it, all you really need to remember are the 5 B's. And the 5 B's meant be brief, brother, be brief. So in conclusion, I want to thank you again for having me. Haven't you heard speeches and you know they never heard of 5 B's? And I'm saying that because I'm going to, I want to share a little bit of my very unlikely journey with you, but I also want to leave some time for questions, and I hopefully you'll have some. And if you don't, I have opinions on just about everything, so you can ask me anything. I was kind of on this path of, living a corporate life, raising a family, and, this idea that I would be an author and the subject of a film. I'm still having a hard time, to be honest, wrapping my head around that. I wasn't trying to do that. In fact, it was sparked by a conversation with Quinn, our oldest boy, when he was a little fella. He's bigger than me now, but when he's a little fella, he would always be the first one to wake up in the house. He's a teenager now. He doesn't do that anymore. I got to go wake him up and rouse him from bed. But when he was younger, he would get up, and I could hear the sound of his footsteps coming down the hall. And I knew that he was coming for me, and he was coming specifically because he wanted to do what was our favorite thing, which was to read his favorite book, which was A Lion and the Mouse. So that's what we would do. Just about every Saturday morning, that was what Quinn and I did. And so he always had questions about the Lion and the Mouse. He's fascinated by how something so small could say something so big. And so there were all these questions all the time. The truth is, I think he liked the fact that I could imitate the voice of a lion. So in his questions, I was always patient asking his questions. But one particular morning, he wheels around on my lap, and he asked me a question that I was not prepared to answer. I knew it would come one day. I thought it would come closer to now when he was about to head off to college, but it wasn't. It was coming from a 6-year-old. And the question he asked me was if, when I was a little boy, did I have a daddy? And I said no. And he said, well, how about a mommy? And I said, again, no. Whenever he doesn't have the answer to something, he still has this habit of kind of looking a little bit skyward, trying to figure out what you've just said to him. And in that moment, I realized that he had the same questions that I had about where I come from, legacy and family. And he had seen mommy's mommy, and he had seen mommy's daddy, but he had never seen mine, and I had never talked about it because I didn't think it would be on his mind. So when I'm often asked, well, how did you, in the middle of such a busy life, wind up becoming a best-selling author, it was because I was trying to answer his question about where was my family. And in my naivete, as a new father, I thought, well, you just answer the first question. that the child gives you, and that should be the end of it. I didn't realize that children will ask you the next question, the next question, the next question, and that's how you wind up writing a book. So, but almost as soon as it was published, something magical began to happen. I had personal reasons. I wanted him to understand, kind of this long road that I took to get to a college campus, because it was quite difficult. But what I really thought would happen is that, future generations of Pembertons would pull the book down and they'd read it maybe, during a family gathering. I had no clue, no idea that it would reach a worldwide audience, and I never imagined, that I would get a call for it to be adapted to a film. The truth is I wasn't trying to do that, but I realized some really important things about family, about faith, about fortitude, about forgiveness, about some of the very things that are missing in our society today. In this desperate need we have to recorrect where we are. I like to think that that's one of our singular attributes as Americans. We know when we overreach, where we overstepped, and there's something that's so deeply troubling about our discourse and yet deeply disconnecting at the same time. So we have all this access, all these technologies and communications, and yet stunningly so, we're becoming increasingly isolated. There's a price to isolation. I felt that. The story that I wound up, sharing came from growing up here in Massachusetts in a community called New Bedford. Or if you're from there, you don't say it that way, you say New Bedford. Leave off the O-R-D. New Bedford has this amazing history, the center of whaling at the turn of the century. In fact, the nickname of the city was a city that lights the world. And so it also was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was the first place that the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass lived when he escaped from the South. Herman Melville wrote the book Moby Dick in the Seamen's Chapel in downtown New Bedford. If you've seen the movie Glory, members of the 54th and 55th Regiments came from New Bedford, including the flag bearer, William Carney. So it has this amazing history. And that was where my story began. The way I began, it was, in essence, what was my first memory of being pulled away from something, somewhere, somehow. I don't know what it is, but I'd remembered it for many years, and I couldn't figure out where that memory came from. Well, many years later, in the course of answering Quinn's question, I requested my case file from the Department of Social Services. I still remember the day it came to my house. It was too big to fit in my mailbox. And even to this day, I don't quite have the vocabulary to express what that was like, to open up the front door of your home and hearing the sound of your file and your life hitting the ground. And you think you know your narrative, but you realize that you don't. And what I came to learn was just how we have these moments of connection and interaction that can bend the arc of a life. It was written of me when I was 1.5 years old by a babysitter who my mother would often come ask to get me and bring me to another family. And she said that she'd be back the next day to get me. And some days she did, and some days she didn't. And even at that very young age, I'm aware that I might not see her for some time. And this one particular time, I am upset about this. I don't clearly want to be taken from her. And the babysitter still has to do what my mother asked him to do. So when he brings me to wherever I'm going, he does so, leaves me there. But that night, he goes home and he writes in his diary, "This little boy doesn't have a chance in the world." Now, I didn't know that for many, many years later, but I didn't need to, because about a year after that, I was taken from my mother, and I never saw her again. I'm too young to have any memory of family, of connection. I don't know who literally I look like. And when you have the appearance that I did, especially as a young boy, my birth name was Steve Klakowitz. I am of light complexion. I have blue eyes and a big blonde afro as a young boy. So every day you get asked, now, what are you? And where do you come from? And, we all have those questions about identity and history and those things. And by and large, for the students here, you, in an ideal world, have mom and dad and extended family to tell you that. But if you don't have that and you don't know where you've come from, those questions are more like accusations. because you don't have any answers. I'd like to tell you that I was taken in by some of the many kind, caring foster families that exist in the world, but that wouldn't be true. I got lost in the gaps over this very issue that I think is perpetuating through society today, this need to identify and locate somebody largely based on these kind of above the waterline mutable characteristics that you come into the world with. When I asked a social worker one time, why was it so hard to find me a home? And she said, in referring to my appearance, she said, well, we don't know if you belong with a white family or a black family. At that age, I was about 7 or so. The only thing that I understood in the way of color was a box of crayons. And so I thought literally that she was referring to the color of the house. And I remember asking myself, well, why does it matter what color the house is? Black, white, purple, yellow, orange. If you'll be safe and there'll be a mother and father and you'll be cared for, that would be home for me. But the hard truth of it is that it never happened. And it didn't happen because of this very need to assess and determine what I was first rather than who I was. And there's a life lesson, I think, in all of us, for all of us, in a moment like that. I'll spend more time trying to figure out who somebody is, their life experiences, their journeys. We all have a story. Your story's brought you here, brought your family here. That story, its peaks and its valleys, aren't evident just by looking at the person to your left and right, front and back. We have no sense of the struggles, the sacrifices, the commitments that we make to create a morning and an afternoon and a weekend like this. You can't ever know that just by the clothes we wear. Even to some degree we share our political affiliations or our religious affiliations. You still don't know the journey that we're all on. I see a pathway through this incredible dissonance when we spend more time trying to better understand the narratives of each other's lives. And I think will find these common threads of humanity when you do so. I managed to get to college. It was quite difficult being in so many different foster homes. The only thing I have going for me really is a love of reading, which I wield relentlessly. And it takes me on paths I could have never really imagined. But while that's happening, I am still burdened by the absence of family. And though it may be odd for me to say this, I wouldn't say that I'm burdened anymore, because in the sense that now I'm a husband and father, and so I have family. But even as I was walking in here, and I'm in Chicago now, and Popeyes, they may have Popeyes there, but they're not nearly as frequent. So I made a beeline to Popeyes downstairs. And I did great justice to the 3-piece chicken meal that was there. Because when I used to come to Northeastern, I used to always swing over to Popeyes. It was across the street then. But I saw your interactions again. I see parents who are so glad to see you. Certainly they're hoping that you're going to write and text more frequently than you do. But there's still that little chord in me that says, oh, so that's what that feels like. Because the hard truth of it is that I'm never going to know that. I don't know family in a traditional way. And as a young boy, I'd always kind of see it in others. I would see resemblances. I would see connections. And because I did, I set my North Star by that. And I aspired to have it one day, and I charted my entire life down that specific path. And my life was actually borne aloft by not family, because I didn't have family. And even those who were supposed to be family were far less than that. And yet, here I am. And the reason was because of the people who did the smallest of things. Most times they were completely unaware of the effect and the impact that they were having. There's a beautiful Greek proverb that says that society grows great when the elders of that society plant trees in whose shade they know they will never sit. And so the people who planted seeds in me, I still remember the mailman in the neighborhood in the middle of this terribly abusive foster home. And I would be there for over 11 years. But Mr. Mead, every time he saw me reading, he would say, now, young man, make sure you keep reading. A neighbor who over the years would bring me books because she saw me reading the same books over and over again, So for well over the decade that I'm there, she always brought me books. Or the high school teacher who took me in just 2 days after Christmas when I had no place left to go. And I'd watched my social worker for the better part of a day calling families trying to get somebody to take me in. I've never known what it's like to be homeless, but I can absolutely share with you what it feels like not to know where you're going to be the next day and how you're going to eat, how you're going to survive. So getting to college for me was home. And that's how I felt about Boston College, where I went to school. But it's also where I felt the same way about Northeastern, because so many of my friends went to school here, and I call them friends to this very day. So the road to get to college was a long and hard one. I used to work on the college campus during the summers, and the reason I did that was because they gave you free housing. Because the truth is, I didn't have anywhere to go. And so, college, even now as I think about home, there's still that thread of, when I think of home, beyond my own, I think of a college campus, actually, because that was the first place that I really felt the safety and the security and the sanctuary that college represents. So this magnificent opportunity and time to explore, to meet people from different parts of the world, to express your views and have your views challenged, to find some sense of community and connection. But it was never lost on me when I arrived on the college campus, had all my belongings in a beat-up yellow suitcase, because that was all the possessions that I had in the world. And I watched my classmates. I'll never forget this. We came onto the dorm floor, and I was watching as they were trying to kind of shove their parents off, like, hey, I want to get on with college, so, you get going. And I remember thinking how fortunate you are, because we come to college, and in some ways we're separating from family, but for me, I was still trying to find family. And I thought, well, that's a fortunate thing to be able to have that luxury of saying, hey, Mom and Dad, I need you to go. I was thinking, Mom and Dad, where are you? I need you to arrive. There's a certain kind of awareness that we should all have about these very, very important moments, kind of what's hanging in the balance. After the book was published, my vision of this was that it would kind of sit on a dusty shelf. And almost immediately, I started hearing from people all over the world who said that I, in writing my story, had written a chapter of their life too. And even for many of you in this room, as I've shared just a cruising altitude of my journey, some of you are nodding in agreement because you too have shared a similar path. They're not all the same paths, nor should they be, but there are common moments of connection that we all have. The first one I received was from a man from Ireland. And he said something that has always stuck with me. He thanked me for writing it, but in the last paragraph he said, I lost a lot of things in my childhood. He described fleeing the famine and losing his family almost seemingly overnight. And he said, I've carried that burden with me my whole life, but because of what you've written, I now have peace. I never imagined those moments that I was writing chapters of his life. I didn't realize I was doing that, but it taught me something about family. It taught me a great deal about fortitude as well. And every day, I can almost set my day by the fact that I'm going to hear from someone. So for all the dissonance and negativity that you see and hear about in the world, I'm not sure that placing our ladders upward, to the seemingly powerful with big titles, and I'm not sure that that's the place where healing is to be found. It's certainly not the place where in this current day and age I think you're going to find connection. Because division, the hard truth of it, is that division is a business model. It gets you votes, gets you to click and share and reshare, drives advertising dollars. It's a business model. And until we as a community, as a broader family, start rejecting that, until we start saying that that is not us, it's not who we are, I don't see any other way that we change that. There's something eminently more unifying, something so much more available to us in these common moments of connection that we have. But we've got to sit down and ask somebody what's their story, not who they voted for, not where they live, where you went to school. It's much more about your life journey, and you find this opportunity to connect accordingly. I never felt that more than when I finally sat down with my family, my biological family. I found them many, many years later. One emigrated from Ireland and the other from the West Indies. And I was struck by the similarity of these families' narratives, both of which had emigrated to America. Both saw and had successes, and both saw tragedies, including the deaths of my parents. And the only thing that was really different about those families, at least as far as I could tell, was the complexion of their skin, because everything else was stunningly similar. And I always thought and felt that it was my responsibility, my opportunity to kind of heal that as best I could by ending a cycle. Because I had inherited a cycle, as had my parents. They had inherited a cycle. Coming to a college campus was an opportunity to end that cycle. Without it, it is entirely possible that it would have blown for another generation, almost like, tumbleweed in an arid desert. It just keeps blowing, seemingly directionless. How does that stop? It stops, I think, because you have some individual agency. You say, no more. I said that. No more. There will be no future generations of Pembertons who will live the way that I did. But one thing that was also instilled in me was the importance of being of value and of service to others. So whether it was the director of an upward bound program, Marjorie Ruby Doughton, going to a Jesuit institution, becoming part of a historically black fraternity, pounded these lessons of civility and service into me. And I realized that you can't be great until you are first good. You've got to be good first. And good in our interactions and our ability not just to empathize, but to act on behalf. We can't see the relentless ongoing violence that is unfolding in society and retreat to our sanctuaries. And ask ourselves, better yet, so what can we do to change this? I think one of the things that we can do is act locally, think locally, remind us as a nation where family really is. So family to me, which I always had a great vision for, was the way that one could actually heal. And, children are at the center of that. Certainly they were for me. So were my early years tough and hard? They were. They were also unnecessary. But I wouldn't trade them, because it brought me to a time and a place. I get to be Tanya's husband and Quinn and Vaughn and Kennedy's dad. I have some of the best friends that anybody could ever ask for. The things that I inherited, I had no say over those. None of us really do. You come into the world an inheritor of things. And it could be great wealth, it could be great fame, but it could also be great tragedy too. And what I've learned is that you're ultimately measured by what you do with what you inherit. Do you build something greater? Do you continue a narrative? What is it that you actually do with your inheritance? And lastly, to the current tone and tenor that is all around us, it's hard to look at so many of the headlines. I don't know about you, but I begin my day trying to figure out how I'm going to assemble the emotional armor to deal, including the tragedy in Pittsburgh this morning and the subsequent politicization of response to those things. So in the quiet of my own heart, I'm wondering, so what do we do, collectively? And some of that, I would argue, is what we're doing here in this time and in this specific moment, that we're bonded by all of us as a smaller community here. Those of us as parents have come back to see the place where our children go into school, and then you, as college students, get to see family, and they get to check in on you and making sure that everything is okay. I think you should make sure that you leave here being connected to another family, somebody who you didn't know before you came here. And they need not look like you or be from the same place that you are. Find those moments of connection. And I'd argue for those of us who are in the early years of our college graduation, our college years before you graduate from here, make sure that you have a network of relationships and connections. Some share your values, but some may see the world differently than you do, and that's perfectly fine, because if you don't do that, as far as I'm concerned, you've gone to the 13th grade, and you could have done that right where you were. But that's the beauty, particularly of a robust and rich campus like Northeastern. That was why for many days, in all honesty, it appealed to me more than Boston College did, because of the diversity of Northeastern. So I found, at least particularly early on, especially my freshman year, I did spend more time here socially than I did on my own campus, because I saw, even back then, a community that accepted me faster than the place that I was going to school. And of course, you're in the college capital of the world. This is the youngest city in the world that changes just like this, so dynamic and so powerful, so instructive for all of us. You know, the importance of family will always be with me. And I would expect, too, that as we kind of reaffirm values, which is kind of what we're doing here, as well, be reminded of not necessarily what great is, because I think, Jim Collins was writing about companies that became great, and he said from good to great, but as he was defining good, he talked about things like humility and accountability and responsibility. That's how greatness is found, actually. And it's found in all of the things that we become a part of. So I said earlier that, the hard truth of it is that I won't know family in the traditional, sense. But being back here, a lot of memories coming back onto the quad. I remember participating in step shows in my fraternity in the quad. A lot of wonderful memories. In fact, if I'm quiet long enough, I can still hear them yelling my name in support. Those are the things that stay with me. Those are the things that connect us. Those are the things that unite us. So let me stop there, because I could write another book if I kept going. But I know that we have some time for some questions. And as I told you earlier, I have opinions on just about everything. Al, how you doing? One of my good friends, who I didn't know he was going to be here. I remember you telling me that earlier. So I won't embarrass you. I certainly won't embarrass you, make you stand up. But good to see you. Oh, we have a microphone coming.
Thank you so much. It seems like I was part of your journey. There were moments where I sort of went along up to a point, and I wonder if you heard from people who read your book about still those dark moments that are still very difficult to sort of get away with. I am a grandmother, I am a mother, I'm a university professor, and my grandson is here. So, yes, you're right, there are moments of joy and happiness, but there are moments that one goes through that are so difficult. There's nothing that really seems to be able to work them into a healing process. So I wonder if you heard more of people who talked about that, not simply commending you on the work that you've done and how it affected them.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a couple of things about that. One, I've learned that the privilege of breathing this air is that you'll know difficulty. None of us gets through this life without it. Challenges, moments where it's hard to put, the next foot in front of you. And so I don't think anybody has cornered the market on that. And I think you know that when you take some time to kind of share those moments, right, of not knowing, like, how am I going to get through to the next day? But I do think what sustains us are the small things that we can do, in those moments of uncertainty and of difficulty. My secret weapon was that I had a vision of a different life than the one that I was in. So any time I was in a valley, I just remembered where it was I was trying to get to. And it just gave me the strength to fight just one more day. And there needs to be a certain kind of healing, too. I think that has to happen, and I can't define what that would be for anybody. I do know that you have to find it, though. Because if you don't, then it can turn to bitterness. It can turn into blaming, scapegoating, pointing the finger at others for, in some cases, decisions that we've made. Certainly one thing I knew that what had unfolded for me in my early years wasn't fair. It wasn't fair. And I didn't deserve it. I didn't ask for it. But the one thing I was very clear about was that I was responsible for it. It was on me to change it. It wasn't going to happen any other way, because everybody who was supposed to help me do that had failed in some way, shape, or form. So this was going to be on me to change. And then lastly, you know, the moments of uncertainty or difficulty, if you may have had moments of being homesick. Maybe a roommate situation isn't working out quite right. Whatever those moments, those are moments also where you build skills and you build what we so desperately need in a society, which is persistence. Not entirely sure of the outcome, right? But you just keep fighting. And I just landed on, for me, to a degree qualifies as a secret. I persist when I am less burdened by the outcome. And I apply that in virtually everything that I do. I sat in front of a number of publishers who told me no. And so I remember thinking, well, I'm going to find out where this goes. Your no only fuels me. Because I didn't want to be on the other end of that and say, well, you know, I let your no stop me. So no, I'm more inclined to double down. And I think when you do that, that's when the universe conspires to show up and help you. We have a general accountability and responsibility to say, how can I help somebody who's in that moment of difficulty? Do I look past it? Or do I see in their vulnerability a moment of vulnerability that I also had? Lastly, if you have a struggle or challenge and you are here, there's somebody out there who needs to hear your story. They need to hear it because they're in a similar moment of difficulty and they don't know how to get through it either. And so they can look at us in particularly those of us who are parents here, and look at our career trajectory in our past and think, oh, well, you always had it easy. Well, no parent in here had it easy. That's not how the world works. But being there in a moment of saying, no, I understand what that's like, and here's how I fought through it. That I've seen time and time again. It changes not just the life in front of you, the life that's in pain, the life that's in difficulty, but it changes the arc of generations. There's something magical, something quite special in that. You got a second book out of me, but thank you.
Other questions? Anyone over here? If you just wouldn't mind passing this on. That's fine.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for your talk. I was just curious about your views on technology and whether you see technology as an enabler for that connectedness that you mentioned as you were speaking.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said. I was, in my love of reading, you'll see a number of Silicon Valley CEOs work really, really hard to keep their young children away from devices. Like, they're working really hard at it. And there is an intention that's unfolded with technology that I think the early adopters, you know, we always envisioned it as something that would connect and unify and find these common threads of humanity. But what's happened is the opposite of that, right? It's the echo chamber of, you know, kind of the tribe finding the tribe. And so it gets us away from these kind of broader narratives. And it's purposefully used at the same time. But I think it's ever necessary. So, you know, societies need to keep growing, evolving, but we are still human beings, and we still have, I think, the ability to leverage that technology for a greater good. And so with 3 teenagers, this is what I talk to them about, is what you're going to do here in sharing, liking, even watching. What is that fundamentally going to improve or change? I wish they had a don't care button on most social media sites. That's my reaction to most things I see. I don't care. I don't care about the silly little pet video, and I don't care, I don't care. I do care about whether or not you're trying to bend the arc of a life, though. That's what I care about. Now, I said earlier that there's this tendency to self-correct, and I do see, particularly because of the Gen Zers, who are going to start using technology to create the world the way they think it should have been, and not the disruptive way that it's being used now. And now that could be wild-eyed optimism, but it's always served me well, so I'm going to keep holding on to that. Yeah. Maybe the best place to find community, you know, these days. Find actual community. And you're not going to find that, which is the other challenge here, you're not going to find that, you know, in 140, 200 characters. I mean, that's going to tell you nobody's story. You and I will co-author that book.
As a fellow parent, right here. As a fellow parent who's spent a lot of time reading to my own child, I have a fun question that perhaps your son would enjoy too. Can we hear a bit of your lion voice?
Wait, say that. I'm going to come down here because
Can we
I
feel?
just want
Can we
to
hear a little?
walk amongst everybody and say hi. So,
No, I
again?
said, as a fellow parent who's spent a lot of time reading my own child, I have a fun question that perhaps your son would enjoy too. Can we hear a bit of your lion voice?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I would have to, gird that up though. But it was the roar. So I tell you a quick story. My publisher calls me and says, "Hey, we want to do the audio version of the book." And I said, "Great." What I was really thinking is, "What are you calling me for?" And he says, "Because we want you to do it." And I was, "Why do you want me to do it?" And because I hadn't actually met the publisher. And they said, "Well, because you have a voice that can do audio versions of books." So here's my naivete. I did not realize the power of the voice. I wrote the book, and so I walked into the studio and I said, "Look, I wrote this, I'm just going to read it." And as soon as I start reading it, I realized this is going to be really, really hard. Even harder than writing it, because if you use your voice to convey an experience, that means emotion. And now you have to relive it. And all of a sudden, I remembered what was hanging in the balance of these really desperate moments, to your point, the dark places. I literally remembered how difficult it was. And yet at the same time, I was just overcome with gratitude by the people who did the small things, whose voices I still remember. I still remember the voice of the woman who came to bring me books. And I remembered because she called me by name. She said, "Hey," when she rang the door of this foster home, she said, "Is Steve there?" And I still remember the sound. So I met her 35 years later. This is amazing. I met her 35 years later, and I got to ask her, "Why did you do that?" And when I talked to her, her voice was exactly the way I remembered it. But she said something so powerful, so instructive. She didn't know how important those books were to me, how important her voice was to me. So 35 years later, I got to tell her just how important she was. And then I got to ask her, "So why'd you do that?" Because you could have kept walking past. We all could do that, right? In moments of great challenge, you could walk past and pretend not to see. But she did see, and she also did something too. And her answer, which I always saw as advice, was, she said, "I was doing something my mother told me to do. Give from where you are with whatever you have. All I had to give you were books that my 3 sons no longer read." And she was in the twilight of her life then. Can you imagine the power of something that you do in a moment like this? Some 35 years later, somebody comes back and says, "If not for your voice, this picture of Tanya and Quinn and Vaughn and Kennedy does not exist." Now, the fact that Claire Levin was Jewish, 4'11", not college educated, was of absolutely no concern to me. No concern whatsoever. My family is bonded to the Levin family forever. I am now a chapter in her family's life, and she is in mine. There's something powerful about that. Okay, that was the 4th book. I saw one question over here. I'll be briefer in my responses, I promise. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks for your story. I think as Americans, we're very drawn to these stories of individuals rising up against adversity and whatever the circumstances and succeeding. But we also know those are the exceptions to the rule. And there's a lot of people who use those kinds of personal stories to suggest that the people who don't succeed are somehow morally, a failure, that they haven't pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And they let the system off the hook, and it becomes all about the individual. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that as you get out and share your story.
Yeah, those are in the worlds of psychology, it's nature versus nurture, right? In sociology, it's agency versus structure, trying to locate where are we to find the responsibility for. I'm always fascinated by the either or, but all of us are the both ands. Right? So when I met my mother and father's family, My father was one of the top amateur fighters in the world. I mean, fighting is what he did. And so he's just a defiant personality. My mother, who runs, her deep Irish roots, was equally defiant. And yet my life went one way and theirs went another. So you'd say that that's the nature part, right? But what was different was the nurturing part that came for me in the interactions and in those moments. And I do think it requires both and. That there's an individual accountability and responsibility that we have to have, but we also at the same time have to expect better of the systems and better of the structures to provide those opportunities. Because the systems and structures, in all honesty, constantly failed me. Constantly. The educational system did. The hospital system did. The court system did. I mean, I remember these moments of, I'm trying to fight, right? I'm trying to use my nature, and yet the system kept failing me, so I just kept. And eventually, I just stopped relying on the system, and I kind of went back to the individuals. And those were the ones who just gave me the strength to fight just one more day. That your question was most clear to me learning the story of my mother and father. My mother, in the middle of a losing battle with alcoholism, estranged from her own family, failed by the systems and structures. She is fighting furiously to be a mother. But she can barely take care of herself, let alone her children. And then she watches as her children are taken away from her, one by one, and then going into a more difficult situation. My father, when he's 15 years old, his mother, Mary Cabral, dies of heart disease at the age of 40. And this family of 13 disintegrates literally overnight. You fast forward 60 years later, the Pembertons have never recovered from that singular event. People don't sign up for that. My mother did not want to lose me, and my father did not want to lose his mother. But in both cases, they were failed by a system. My grandmother, her heart disease had gone undiagnosed and untreated, and she passes away at 40. That was a failure of a system. So what do we do about it? Well, in any form that we are, Mrs. Levin's advice, give from where you are with whatever you have. People don't always want the situations, and if you look hard enough, you will see the fight in them. I mean, they're kicking and clawing and scratching. I mean, they want a better life. Nobody signs up to have their children taken away from them. Nobody wants that. My mother did not want that. I always thought it was my responsibility to raise my voice to help improve systems, but expect accountability too. Like, that's a duality of a chance, right? That's what a chance is. We want a chance. We're products of a chance, but especially for those of you who are younger and here in the room, you got to do something with your chance. You have to do something with it. And if you don't get that right, then second, third chance. But you keep coming. That's just the way that this world works, the way the society works. That part I think we're missing, and we're going to have to re-anchor ourselves around it. Yes, sir.
Would you mind just passing us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. My question may be trivial, but it would haunt me if I didn't ask. The Pembertons, you said they are West Indian heritage. Could you please specify?
My grandfather, as near as I can tell, this is a story that's always unfolding, was from Trinidad and Tobago. I get an applause. I hear some applause over there. See, I bet you if we go back, you might find some family, some family connection along the way, right? Yeah, the Pemberton, Joe Pemberton. My middle name is Joseph, and my grandfathers were Joseph Murphy and Joseph Pemberton. And so, you can see there's a certain kind of universe that conspires to make sure that a generation will continue. I said at the outset, I'll tell you a quick story about how I met my wife, who I proposed to, as I told you earlier, right down the street. She went to school in New Jersey, and I was on vacation with my friends, actually from Northeastern. We were over on Martha's Vineyard. How many of you have been to Martha's Vineyard? Al and I hang out there all the time, right? So, and you've been to Oak Bluffs? Right, so I was walking down the street with a group of my buddies, and a group of women are walking towards us. And this is for the young folks in the room, too, because there's a lot of lessons in here. So, and one of my friends stops to talk to one of the women in the group, and I wind up just standing next to another young lady. And 5-minute conversation. Didn't talk particularly long. And my friend comes over to me and he says, hey, she's married. And I looked and I said, well, I was thinking, like, no, she's not married. And she corrects him and she says, well, he's trying to tell you that I'm engaged. And she was engaged. And I said, well, congratulations. As she walked away, I thought, man, the man marrying her is going to be really, really lucky. And I didn't think anything more of it. Well, another year passes. I'm back on Martha's Vineyard again. And I see a very striking woman who keeps staring at me. Now, ordinarily, like you, I'm a really cool guy. Like, I don't ever get knocked off my swagger, like ever. But every time she was kind of over there and men in the room, we look and then we look away. So that's what I was doing. I was looking away. And every time I looked over in her direction, she would look back at me. Knocked all the cool out of my stride. I had no cool left. She walks over to me and she says, I know you. And I did the worst thing you could do in that moment. Don't do this. I said, you do? Because I had never seen her before. I was so surprised. And she does something I thought was so important, actually, because she thought that I was being pretty boy. And she says, she gently puts her arm on my forearm. She says, I must be mistaken. And she walked away. And she got about 5 feet away from me, and I am trying to, oh, yes. I remember. See, he's smiling because he did that too. And I said, oh, yes, I remember. I'm saying this to myself. And I was thinking, how in the world am I going to recover this? So I walked over to her and I said, I'm sorry, I remember you. We met last year. Your name is Tanya. Your friends called you T. You're from New Jersey. You went to school at the University of Maryland. When we met, we were right across from Ben and Bill's. You were standing to my left. You had on yellow shorts and a blue parka. Your hair was pulled back. And are you still engaged? So her friends are upset at me because I'm messing up the girls' weekend. And I don't care. I didn't care. And so she's not here. Al, don't tell her. I was chasing her. Because I just thought, if you don't find out what's going on here, you're going to remember this person your whole life. And the point of that is to take a risk, right? Take a risk. Her friends say to her, you spend all your time talking to this guy and you don't even know his last name. By that time, I changed my last name from Clackowitz to Pemberton. And in a moment of either great bravado or great stupidity, I said, in response, will you tell your friends that my last name is Pemberton, and one day that will be your name too. That's right, I said it. Now, for the young fellas in the room, I know what you're thinking. That was a really, really cool line. I see you smiling. Boy, let's see. I might say that on the quad this weekend. Hey, but listen, if it works for you, invite me to the wedding. But 21 years later, single smartest thing I did. I know I'm at time. I've got to keep you on schedule. I'll be around for a little bit longer before I have to head back to the airport. Thanks again, and have a great rest of the weekend. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Steve, for sharing your words and your life experiences. Both are very thought-provoking, and obviously his resilience is admirable.